A man found a blind lynx cub and decided to save it. But the next morning, something surprising happened. What was waiting for him at his doorstep will leave you speechless. Stay until the end and find out how this unbelievable story ends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Few dared to cross the narrow, misty paths of the Cascade Wilderness as dusk settled over Pine Hollow. The small town of Oak Ridge, Oregon, nestled between ancient trees and whispered legends, held its own unwritten rules. The locals knew that after sunset, the forest transformed into a realm of secrets, where only the animals understood the silent. Laws that governed the shadows between towering Douglas firs. Mason Reed had lived in his isolated cabin for nearly a decade, the smell of burning pine and the morning birdsong his most faithful companions. A former wildlife photographer whose passion had once taken him across national parks throughout America, Mason now preferred the predictable rhythm of solitude. His weathered face, framed by a salt and pepper beard, rarely broke into smiles these days. The lines around his eyes spoke of both wonder and sorrow, emotions he had experienced in equal measure during his 53 years. Every afternoon, Mason followed the same ritual, walking the lesser-known trails with a practiced step, his worn hiking boots navigating the terrain without conscious thought. The forest knew him, and he knew the forest, a silent agreement forged through years of coexistence. The locals from Oak Ridge occasionally spotted him purchasing supplies at Harriet's general store, but knew better than to engage beyond polite nods. The mountain man, as they called him behind his back, preferred it that way. "Heading back before dark, Mr. Reed?" Harriet Thompson asked one Tuesday afternoon, as Mason placed his usual items on the counter: coffee, canned beans, flour, and a single bar of dark chocolate, his only indulgence. "Always do," he replied, his voice carrying the slight hoarseness of someone unaccustomed to conversation. "Storms coming in from the north. Might want to stock up extra this time." Harriet's eyes, magnified behind thick glasses, held genuine concern. Mason merely nodded, adding a few more items to his purchase. He didn't mind storms, sometimes he even welcomed them, finding comfort in the way thunder echoed through the valleys, reminding him that even in his isolation, greater forces moved above and around him. That particular afternoon, as grey clouds gathered above the treetops, Mason ventured slightly further along his usual path. The air carried a peculiar stillness that experienced outdoorsmen recognized as the calm before nature unleashed its power. He intended to gather extra firewood before the downpour began, his weathered canvas bag already half filled with kindling. It was then, in that moment of hushed anticipation, that Mason noticed something unusual near the base of a massive cedar tree. At first, he thought it was merely a clump of fallen moss or perhaps a displaced bird's nest, but then it moved ever so slightly. Mason froze, his instincts honed by years in the wilderness. He crouched, keeping his distance yet straining to identify the small form partially hidden among fallen leaves. A soft, barely audible mewling sound reached his ears, and his heartbeat quickened. As he carefully approached, what he discovered rooted him to the spot. A bobcat kitten, its grey speckled fur still fluffy with youth, trembling and disoriented. Mason observed the small creature bumping into leaves and branches as it tried to move, its movements hesitant and uncertain. Something wasn't right. Mason kept perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable appearance of the mother. Wild animals rarely abandon their young without reason. Minutes passed, the gathering darkness deepening the shadows around them. No adult bobcat appeared. With practiced caution, Mason circled the area, looking for signs of the mother or perhaps, though he dreaded the thought, evidence of what might have happened to her. He found nothing, only the increasingly distressed mewls of the kitten as it continued its confused movements. It took only a moment longer for Mason to understand. The kitten was blind. Its cloudy eyes stared unseeingly, pupils unresponsive to the flashlight he cautiously shone near its face. The kitten's ears, however, swiveled immediately toward the sound of Mason shifting his weight, demonstrating that its other senses functioned perfectly. "Where's your mama, little one?" Mason whispered, more to himself than to the animal. The forest seemed to answer with the first heavy drops of rain pattering against the canopy above. Mason hesitated, his mind racing through the realities of nature. The wilderness was unforgiving to the vulnerable. A blind bobcat kitten, alone in the coming storm, faced virtually impossible odds. Mason had always lived by one central principle during his years in these woods: never interfere with nature's ways. He wasn't one of those well-intentioned but misguided tourists who removed fawns they mistakenly believed abandoned or fed wild animals until they lost their natural wariness of humans. He understood the delicate balance of the ecosystem and his place as an observer, not a participant. Yet something about this particular situation pierced through the careful boundaries he had established. Perhaps it was the kitten's determined struggle despite its disability, or perhaps it was something deeper that Mason wasn't ready to acknowledge. A recognition of vulnerability that echoed in places of his own heart he had long closed off. The rain intensified, and in one fluid motion, Mason removed his flannel outer shirt, approaching the kitten with slow, deliberate movements. The small creature hissed weakly, more fearful than threatening. I know, Mason murmured. "You don't want my help, but tonight you need it." With skills developed through years of handling camera equipment around skittish wildlife, Mason carefully wrapped the shirt around the kitten, creating a secure bundle that both protected and restrained the animal. The bobcat complained with a surprisingly loud yowl for its size, but Mason held firm, tucking the bundle inside his jacket as the sky fully opened above them. As he made his way back toward his cabin, moving faster now, against the pelting rain, Mason felt the small heartbeat against his chest, rapid and strong despite everything. The right thing, he kept telling himself, would be to contact Jennifer Wilcox, the local wildlife rehabilitator, in the morning. She would know what to do with a blind bobcat kitten. That was the responsible choice. But as the storm intensified, and lights from Mason's cabin came into view through the trees, another thought formed, one that both troubled and intrigued him. What if there was more to this unexpected encounter than chance? What if, after years of choosing isolation, something had chosen to find him instead? Thunder cracked overhead as Mason reached his porch, the bundle against his chest now still, either from exhaustion or a tenuous trust. Inside, the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke welcomed them as Mason carefully placed the wrapped kitten near the warmth of his wood stove. "Just for tonight," he said aloud, as if making a promise to the forest itself. "Just until the storm passes." As Mason moved around his cabin, preparing a makeshift bed for his unexpected guest, he couldn't have known about the pair of amber eyes watching from the darkened tree line, unblinking, patient, and far more aware of what had transpired than any human could comprehend. The night had only just begun, and with it, a story neither man nor nature had anticipated. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence that follows mountain storms, sunlight filtering through Mason's windows in diagonal beams that illuminated dancing dust particles. For a moment, in the hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, Mason forgot about his unusual houseguest. Then came a sound, a soft scraping followed by a plaintive mewl that instantly brought the previous evening's events rushing back. The bobcat kitten had survived the night and, judging by the noises, had found some energy to explore its surroundings. Mason rose from his bed, pulling on a clean flannel shirt as he moved cautiously toward the small box he'd prepared near the stove. It was empty. "Where did you get to?" he murmured, scanning the cabin's main room. He found the kitten beneath, His worn leather reading chair pressed against the wall, ears flattened in defensive posture. Despite its blindness, the animal sensed his approach instantly, turning its face toward the sound of his footsteps and releasing a hiss that seemed comically disproportionate to its small size. "Bold little thing, aren't you?" Mason couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips, the first in longer than he could remember. "Hungry, I bet." The practical challenges of caring for a wild predator, even an infant one, presented themselves immediately. Mason's refrigerator held nothing suitable for a carnivore. He would need to visit town again, an unusual break in his routine that would surely raise eyebrows. While considering his options, Mason observed the kitten attempting to navigate the unfamiliar terrain of his cabin floor. Despite its blindness, the animal moved with surprising determination, using its whiskers and acute hearing to build a mental map of its surroundings. Each obstacle encountered was carefully investigated through touch and smell before being either circumvented or climbed over. "You're a survivor," Mason commented, impressed despite himself. He spent the morning creating a more suitable enclosure. A large wooden crate lined with soft blankets, equipped with a shallow dish for water and positioned where sunshine would warm it for part of the day. The kitten protested when Mason eventually picked it up to place it in this new space, but with less vigor than before, as if some instinctive understanding had formed between them. By mid-afternoon, necessity drove Mason back to Oak Ridge. The bell above Harriet's general store door announced his entrance, causing several heads to turn in surprise at his second appearance in as many days. "Mason, read twice in 1 week," Harriet said, not bothering to hide her curiosity. "Must be some kind of record." Mason nodded politely, but offered no explanation as he gathered supplies. Whole milk, canned tuna, and several other items that might substitute for a bobcat's natural diet until he could formulate a better plan. "Planning a special dinner?" Harriet inquired as she rang up his unusual selections. "Something like that," Mason replied vaguely. As he waited for Harriet to complete his transaction, Mason noticed a flyer posted on the community bulletin board. "Wildlife Rehabilitation Workshop. Learn from expert Jennifer Wilcox," it announced in bold letters, scheduled for the coming Saturday at the Oak Ridge Community Center. "Jenny's gotten quite passionate about her rescue work," Harriet commented, following Mason's gaze. "Started after she took in that injured eagle last year. Now she's practically running a hospital for woodland creatures out of her place on Elder Creek Road." Mason carefully memorized the address listed on the flyer. Jennifer Wilcox might have the expertise he needed, though something held him back from immediately seeking her assistance. He wasn't ready to relinquish the kitten, not yet at least. The journey back to his cabin took longer than usual, as Mason deliberately chose less traveled paths, avoiding the few hikers who might be curious about his purchases. When he finally arrived home, an unexpected sight greeted him at the edge of his clearing. Fresh tracks circled his cabin, clearly feline but much larger than his tiny guest could make. A full-grown bobcat had visited during his absence. Mason crouched to examine the prints more closely, noting their purposeful pattern. Not random wandering, but deliberate investigation. The mother had tracked her offspring to his doorstep. Inside, Mason found the kitten exactly where he'd left it, though now curled into a tight ball of sleep. He watched its small sides rise and fall with each breath, struck by the sudden complexity of his situation. The mother's appearance changed everything. She hadn't abandoned her kitten, she was searching for it. As dusk approached, Mason prepared a mixture of milk and tuna, warming it slightly before offering it to the wakened kitten. After initial hesitation, hunger overcame wariness, and the small creature ate ravenously, its pink tongue lapping at the unusual meal with surprising delicacy. "Your mama's looking for you," Mason told the kitten as it ate, "but I'm not sure. You'd survive out there, little one, not with those eyes. That night, Mason left his window slightly ajar, allowing the forest scents to permeate his cabin. If the mother returned, perhaps she would sense her offspring's presence. He settled into his chair with a book, but found himself unable to focus on the words, his attention repeatedly drawn to the small creature that had disrupted his solitary existence. The night deepened, bringing with it the familiar symphony of wilderness sounds, the distant call of an owl, the rustling of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. Mason dozed intermittently, waking fully when an unfamiliar sound cut through the darkness, a soft thud against his porch steps, followed by silence. Moving with practiced quiet, Mason approached his window and peered out into the moonlit clearing. There, at the edge of his porch, sat a freshly killed rabbit, and just beyond, barely visible in the shadows between trees, two reflective eyes watched the cabin with unwavering attention. The bobcat mother had brought an offering, food for her kitten, left at the threshold of the human dwelling where her offspring's scent led. The gesture's meaning struck Mason with unexpected force. This wasn't merely animal instinct, it represented a complex understanding he hadn't anticipated. "She knows you're here," he whispered to the kitten, who had awakened and was alertly facing the window, nostrils flaring as it caught familiar scents on the breeze. "And she's still taking care of you." Mason faced an ethical dilemma more complicated than he'd initially imagined. The mother clearly hadn't abandoned her blind kitten. Perhaps they'd been separated by accident during the storm. But could a blind bobcat survive in the wild, even with its mother's protection? The forest held countless dangers that required acute visual awareness to navigate. Over the following days, a strange routine developed. Each night, evidence of the mother's visitation appeared. Sometimes another offering of food, other times simply fresh tracks circling the cabin. Mason began leaving his own offerings. In return, small dishes of water or bits of food, which disappeared by morning. The kitten, meanwhile, showed remarkable adaptability. Despite its blindness, it learned the layout of Mason's cabin with impressive speed, navigating around furniture and climbing onto surfaces with increasing confidence. Its other senses clearly compensated for the missing sight. Ears constantly swiveling to track sounds, whiskers and nose working in concert to build an invisible map of its surroundings. Mason found himself talking to the kitten, at first just simple observations about the weather or tasks he was performing. Gradually, these one-sided conversations expanded, becoming reflections on his day, memories from his past, even philosophical musings about his place in the natural world. The kitten couldn't understand his words, of course, but it responded to his voice, often approaching when he spoke, and sometimes settling near him as he talked. "Never thought I'd be sharing my space again," Mason admitted one evening as the kitten curled against his leg while he sat reading. "Been a long time since I let anyone this close." The statement hung in the air, carrying more weight than Mason had intended. It had been exactly 7 years since he'd retreated to this cabin, seeking escape from a world that had taken everything he loved. 7 years of deliberately constructed solitude, of careful emotional distance from the people in Oak Ridge, of quiet days and silent nights spent in the company of memories he couldn't quite bring himself to face. Now, watching the small wild creature that had somehow breached his defenses, Mason felt something shifting within himself, a hairline crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. The kitten's vulnerability should have repelled him, should have reinforced his conviction that attachment only led to loss. Instead, it had awakened something he thought long buried, a capacity for care that both frightened and compelled him. "What am I going to do with you?" he asked softly, receiving no answer except the gentle rumble of the kitten's unexpected purr. Outside, unseen in the gathering darkness, the mother bobcat settled on a fallen log with a direct view of Mason's cabin. Her patience was a testament to a bond Mason was only beginning to understand, one that would soon challenge everything he believed about the wilderness he called home and the barriers he had built around his heart. Saturday arrived with the golden warmth of late spring sunshine, and Mason found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, preparing to attend a community event. The wildlife rehabilitation workshop flyer had remained in his thoughts all week, and the growing complexity of his situation with the bobcat kitten and its vigilant mother pushed him toward seeking expert advice. As Mason parked his seldom-used truck at the Oak Ridge Community Center, he felt distinctly out of place. The small parking lot contained a dozen vehicles, representing a larger gathering than he had willingly joined since his self-imposed exile. He sat for a moment, fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel, considering whether to simply drive back to his cabin. "Mason? Mason Reed, is that you?" The voice startled him, and he turned to find Sam Peterson, Oak Ridge's postal carrier, approaching his window with undisguised surprise. "Thought I recognized this old Ford. Haven't seen you at a town event since." "Well, must be years now." "Just here for the wildlife talk," Mason replied, reluctantly rolling down his window. "Heard Jennifer Wilcox knows her stuff." "That she does. Turned her whole property into a rehabilitation center after retiring from teaching. Regular Dr. Doolittle, that woman." Sam studied Mason with unconcealed curiosity. "Must be something important to bring you down from your mountain." Mason nodded noncommittally and finally forced himself to exit the truck. "Good seeing you, Sam," he said, effectively ending the conversation as he headed toward the community center's entrance. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing a small presentation area equipped with a projector screen. About 15 people had already gathered, most engaged in the comfortable chatter of neighbors and friends. Mason chose a seat in the back row, slightly apart from the others, and focused on the photographs displayed on the walls, local wildlife captured in various natural settings. "Welcome, everyone." A confident voice cut through the conversations, and all eyes turned to the front, where a woman in her early 60s stood, her silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. Jennifer Wilcox had the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of her time outdoors and moved with the deliberate efficiency of a person accustomed to handling unpredictable animals. "I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces today, and even some new ones." Her gaze lingered briefly on Mason, and he felt an uncomfortable prickle of recognition. Had they met before? He couldn't place her, though something about her seemed vaguely familiar. For the next hour, Jennifer delivered an informative presentation about wildlife rehabilitation, covering everything from initial assessment procedures to feeding techniques for different species. Mason listened intently, mentally taking notes on details relevant to bobcat care. Jennifer's expertise was evident, not just in her technical knowledge, but in the compassionate approach she advocated. "The goal is always release," she emphasized, showing slides of successfully rehabilitated animals returning to their natural habitats. "We must remember that our intervention, however well-intentioned, is a disruption. Our responsibility is to heal without creating dependency, to help without changing the essential wildness that defines these creatures." Her words resonated uncomfortably with Mason, who had been questioning his own judgment in keeping the blind kitten. The mother's continued presence complicated matters further. Was he interfering with a natural relationship by holding on to the kitten? As the workshop concluded, and people began mingling over coffee and cookies provided by the Oak Ridge Women's Club, Mason gathered his courage and approached Jennifer, who was answering questions from an enthusiastic teenager about raccoon rehabilitation. "Ms. Wilcox," Mason waited until the teenager moved away. "I was hoping to ask you about a specific situation." Jennifer turned, her green eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Mason Reed, I wondered if you'd ever come to one of these workshops." Her tone carried no judgment, only mild surprise. "And please, it's Jenny to everyone except my former students." "You know me?" Mason asked, caught off guard. "Oak Ridge is a small town, Mr. Reed, and your photography was featured in National Geographic. Hard to forget." She smiled at his evident discomfort. "But you wanted to ask about a situation." Mason hesitated, suddenly aware of nearby listeners. "It's about a bobcat kitten. Found it during the storm last week. It's blind, but otherwise healthy." Jenny's expression shifted to professional interest. "And you've been caring for it for a week?" "Yes, but there's more to it. The mother has been visiting my cabin every night, leaving food for it, circling the property. She knows where her kitten is." Jenny gestured toward the exit. "Let's talk outside." Once they were standing in the spring sunshine, away from curious ears, Jenny's demeanor became more serious. A blind bobcat kitten with an attentive mother is an unusual case. In most circumstances, nature would have taken its course. "You mean the mother would have abandoned it?" Mason stated flatly. "Often, yes. Resources are precious in the wild. Investing in offspring unlikely to survive is rarely nature's way." Jenny studied him thoughtfully. "Yet this mother is still providing care, even separated from her kitten. That's remarkable." "What would you recommend?" Mason asked, feeling simultaneously relieved to share his burden and defensive about the bond he'd developed with the small creature. "Normally, I'd say bring the kitten to my facility immediately," Jenny replied. "But the continued presence of the mother changes things. Tell me, how is the kitten adapting to its blindness?" Mason described the animal's impressive navigation skills, its growing confidence, and its apparent health. "It's learning to compensate with its other senses. Sometimes I almost forget it can't see." Jenny nodded, considering. "Bobcats are incredibly adaptable. With a protective mother, it's possible." She paused, clearly weighing professional protocol against the unique circumstances. "Would you be willing to show me? I'd like to examine the kitten and assess the situation firsthand." The request triggered Mason's instinctive resistance to visitors. His cabin was his sanctuary, his private refuge from human connection. Yet the need for expert guidance outweighed his discomfort. "Tomorrow afternoon," he heard himself say. "I can text you the directions." They exchanged contact information, and as Mason prepared to leave, Jenny placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Mason, I have to ask, why did you take in this kitten? From everything I've heard, you've gone to great lengths to avoid entanglements of any kind these past years." The question struck closer to home than Mason was prepared for. He looked away, his gaze finding the distant outline of the mountains where his cabin stood. "Sometimes we recognize something of ourselves in other creatures," he finally said, the words emerging from a place he rarely acknowledged. "Sometimes helping them is a way of helping ourselves." Jenny's expression softened with understanding. "Tomorrow, then." The drive back to his cabin gave Mason ample time to question his decision. Bringing Jennifer Wilcox into his private world meant exposing not just the kitten, but himself to outside scrutiny. For 7 years, he had carefully maintained his isolation, protecting the raw wounds that had driven him from his previous life. Now, in less than a week, a blind bobcat kitten had somehow circumvented all his defenses. As Mason approached his cabin, he noticed something unusual, fresh bobcat tracks that led not away from his home but toward it in broad daylight. The mother had visited recently, breaking her pattern of nocturnal appearances. Something had changed. Inside, Mason found the kitten in a state of heightened alertness, its ears swiveling constantly, small body tense with attention. It sensed something that Mason could not. Perhaps the lingering scent of its mother, closer than ever before. "She's getting bolder," Mason told the kitten as he prepared their evening meal. Or maybe more desperate. That night, Mason woke to a sound he'd never heard before, a soft, distinctive call just outside his window. Not quite a meow, not quite a growl, but something in between. The specific vocalization of a mother bobcat calling to her young. Mason lay perfectly still, listening as the call came again, closer this time. The kitten responded immediately, scrambling from its bed and moving with unprecedented determination toward the source of the sound. Bumping into furniture in its haste, Mason rose slowly and moved to the window. In the silver wash of moonlight, he could clearly see the mother bobcat standing in the center of his clearing, her tawny coat glowing like burnished gold. She was larger than he had imagined, powerful and graceful, her amber eyes fixed unwaveringly on his cabin. She called again, and inside the kitten cried in response, pawing frantically at the door. For a moment, frozen in time, Mason watched this exchange, understanding with sudden clarity that he stood at a crossroads. He could open the door, allowing nature to take whatever course awaited a blind kitten in the wilderness, or he could maintain his intervention, potentially denying both mother and offspring their natural connection. Before he could decide, the mother bobcat did something extraordinary. She moved forward, approaching the cabin with deliberate steps, displaying none of the caution wild predators typically showed around human dwellings. At the base of his porch steps, she deposited something from her mouth, another offering. And then, instead of retreating, she sat, waiting. The boldness of this act stunned Mason. It represented a level of trust or desperation he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't merely a mother searching for her lost young. This was communication, intentional, directed, and unmistakable. "What are you trying to tell me?" Mason whispered to the night. Inside, the kitten continued its determined efforts to reach the door, guided by sound and scent rather than sight. Its persistence spoke volumes. Blind or not, it recognized its mother's call and sought reunion with a primal urgency that transcended its disability. Mason spent the remainder of the night in his chair, watching the remarkable tableau unfold. The mother remained at the edge of his porch until false dawn, occasionally calling to her kitten, sometimes simply waiting in statuesque stillness. The kitten, meanwhile, eventually exhausted itself and fell asleep, pressed against the door, as close to its mother as the barrier would allow. By morning, the mother had vanished, leaving behind only tracks and the gift she had brought, a small, intricately woven nest of twigs, moss, and feathers, perfectly sized for her kitten. Mason carefully collected this offering, recognizing it as far more than simple animal behavior. In this deliberate construction, he sensed an intelligence and intention that challenged his understanding of the creatures with whom he shared the forest. As he prepared for Jennifer Wilcox's visit later that day, Mason found himself facing questions that extended far beyond wildlife rehabilitation. What obligations did humans have toward the natural world? Where was the line between compassion and interference? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what was he really protecting? In his self-imposed isolation, the purity of nature or the fragility of his own wounded heart? The answers remained elusive, but as Mason watched the blind kitten exploring its surroundings with determined curiosity, he recognized that some connections, once formed, could not easily be severed, not without profound consequences for all involved. Jennifer Wilcox arrived at Mason's cabin precisely at the agreed time, her practical SUV navigating the rough access road with experienced ease. Mason watched her approach from his porch, a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension tightening his chest. It had been years since he'd invited anyone to his sanctuary. "Beautiful place you've made for yourself up here," Jenny commented as she exited her vehicle, taking in the cabin and its surroundings with appreciative eyes. "Though I imagine the winters are challenging." "I prefer the solitude," Mason replied, immediately regretting the defensiveness in his tone. If Jenny noticed, she gave no indication. Instead, she retrieved a worn leather bag from her passenger seat, clearly her wildlife assessment kit and approached with the confident stride of someone comfortable in natural settings. "So where's our patient?" she asked, following Mason inside. The kitten had sensed their arrival and retreated to its favorite hiding spot beneath Mason's reading chair. Jenny didn't immediately approach it, instead taking a moment to observe from a distance. "Male or female?" she asked. "Male, I think," Mason replied. "Haven't checked too thoroughly, didn't want to stress him unnecessarily." Jenny nodded approvingly. "And you've been feeding him?" "Started with milk and tuna, moved to ground turkey and chicken livers after researching online. Plus whatever the mother brings, mostly rabbits and squirrels lately." Jenny's eyebrows rose. "She's bringing prey directly to your cabin. That's remarkable behavior for a wild bobcat." She set her bag down slowly, minimizing noise. "Tell me exactly what you've observed about the mother's patterns." Mason detailed the nightly visits, the offerings, the previous night's bold approach, and the nest left behind. As he spoke, he realized how much he'd been noticing, how carefully he'd been tracking these interactions. "May I see the nest?" Jenny asked when he finished. Mason retrieved it from the shelf where he'd placed it. Jenny examined it with expert interest, her fingers gently probing the construction. "This isn't random," she said finally. "The weaving pattern shows intention, and these feathers, they're arranged by size and color." She looked up at Mason, her expression thoughtful. "In my 20 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've never seen anything quite like this." What does it mean?" Mason asked. "I'm not sure we have language for what it means," Jenny admitted. "But it suggests a level of cognitive complexity we don't typically attribute to bobcats." They turned their attention to the kitten, who had remained hidden throughout their conversation. Jenny approached with practiced patience, speaking in soft, even tones as she gradually closed the distance. To Mason's surprise, the kitten responded to her voice with curiosity rather than fear, eventually emerging from beneath the chair to investigate this new presence. Jenny's examination was gentle but thorough. She checked the kitten's weight, coat condition, ears, teeth, and finally, his clouded eyes. "Congenital blindness," she confirmed. "He was born this way. The eye structures developed incorrectly." She stroked the kitten's head gently. "In the wild, such kittens rarely survive the first weeks. Mothers typically recognize the disability and nature takes its course." "But not this mother," Mason said. "No, not this mother." Jenny sat back, on her heels, watching as the kitten confidently navigated back toward Mason, using his voice as a beacon. "She's demonstrating extraordinary commitment. The question is why and what our responsibility is in this situation." They moved to Mason's small kitchen table, where Jenny accepted the offered coffee. Through the window, the forest stretched endlessly, afternoon sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. "Professionally speaking," Jenny began, wrapping her hands around the warm mug, "I should advocate for bringing him to my facility. We could provide specialized care, perhaps eventually place him in a wildlife education program where his needs could be accommodated." Mason felt an unexpected tightness in his throat at the thought of the kitten leaving. "And personally speaking?" he asked. Jenny studied him for a long moment before answering. "Personally, I believe we're witnessing something exceptional. This mother-kitten bond has transcended what we typically understand about wildlife behavior. The mother is adapting her strategies to accommodate her kitten's disability, and more remarkably, she's attempting communication with you. With me." Mason felt a chill travel up his spine. The offerings, the nest, her willingness to remain visible near your cabin, these aren't typical behaviors. She's reaching across a divide that most wild creatures never attempt to cross. Jenny's gaze was steady, challenging. "The question is why she believes you, specifically, can be trusted with her blind kitten." The question hung between them, layered with implications Mason wasn't ready to examine. Before he could formulate a response, a scratching sound drew their attention to the door. "That's new," Mason said, rising. "To investigate." Through the window beside the door, they saw the source of the sound, and both froze in astonishment. The mother bobcat stood directly on Mason's porch, her tawny form clearly visible in broad daylight, one paw raised as if prepared to scratch again. "Incredible," Jenny whispered, careful not to make sudden movements. "She's deliberately seeking contact." Inside, the kitten reacted immediately to his mother's proximity, moving toward the door with determined focus, releasing the distinctive mewling sound Mason had heard on the night they met. Time seemed suspended as Mason and Jenny watched this extraordinary scene unfold. The mother bobcat remained on the porch, occasional soft vocalizations passing between her and the kitten through the wooden barrier of the door. "What should I do?" Mason asked, his voice barely audible. "That depends," Jenny replied, her professional demeanor giving way to wonder on what you believe is happening here. Mason's thoughts raced through everything he'd witnessed over the past week. The nighttime visits, the offerings, the nest, and now this bold daylight appearance. A pattern emerged that challenged everything he thought he understood about the natural world. "I think," he said slowly, "she's asking for my help." Jenny nodded, as if his conclusion confirmed her own thoughts. "The question is, what kind of help? Does she want her kitten back, despite his blindness? Or is she seeking something else entirely?" The kitten continued his determined efforts to reach the door, small body trembling with the intensity of his desire to reach his mother. His blindness seemed irrelevant in this moment, other senses guiding him unerringly toward the parent. He couldn't see but clearly sensed. "I need to let them reunite," Mason decided suddenly, if only briefly, to see what happens. Jenny looked concerned. "Are you sure that's wise? If the kitten returns to the wild with his mother, his chances of survival are uncertain at best." "So are all of ours," Mason replied with unexpected emotion. "But we still deserve the chance to try." With careful movements, Mason approached the door. The kitten sensed his proximity and backed away slightly, though his attention remained fixed on his mother's presence beyond. Mason hesitated, hand on the doorknob, knowing that opening this barrier might change everything, for the kitten, for the mother, and perhaps for himself. "I'll stay back," Jenny offered, understanding the delicacy of the moment. "Just observe what happens." Mason nodded gratefully and slowly, deliberately opened the door, just wide enough for the kitten to pass through if it chose. Then he stepped back, creating space for whatever might unfold. The mother bobcat didn't flee at the door's opening. Instead, she remained perfectly still, amber eyes fixed on Mason with an intensity that seemed to evaluate his every movement, his intentions, perhaps even his character. The kitten, sensing the open door, moved forward hesitantly, nose and whiskers, working frantically to process the rush of outside scents. What happened next unfolded with such natural grace that it seemed choreographed. The kitten crossed the threshold onto the porch. The mother approached slowly, making soft sounds unlike anything Mason had heard before. Their reunion was a symphony of gentle touches. The mother's nose investigating every inch of her offspring, the kitten pressing against her familiar scent, small sounds passing between them that seemed to carry volumes of meaning. Mason and Jenny watched in reverent silence, witnessing something few humans ever had. The intimate communication between wild creatures, unguarded and authentic. Minutes passed, neither human willing to interrupt this sacred reunion. Finally, the mother bobcat did something that caused both observers to gasp softly. She turned toward Mason, her kitten now pressed securely against her side, and met his gaze directly. The look contained no fear, no aggression, only a profound awareness that Mason couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, with deliberate movements, She guided her blind kitten back toward the open door of the cabin. "She's returning him to you," Jenny whispered in disbelief. The kitten, following his mother's guidance, crossed back over the threshold. The mother remained outside, watching as her offspring navigated the familiar territory of Mason's cabin floor. She made no move to follow, nor to retreat into the forest. Instead, she settled onto her haunches, a sentinel at the boundary between human and wild domains. "I don't understand," Mason said, his voice thick with confusion. "I'm not sure we can understand, not fully," Jenny replied. "But I think we're witnessing a mother making an impossible choice, recognizing that her blind kitten might have better chances here with you than facing the dangers of the forest." The weight of this interpretation settled over Mason like a physical presence. If Jenny was right, this wild creature had evaluated him and found him worthy of trust with her most vulnerable offspring. The responsibility was simultaneously overwhelming and profound. As if confirming their interpretation, the mother bobcat, Rose, gave one final look at her kitten, now exploring Mason's cabin with renewed confidence, then turned and disappeared into the undergrowth with silent efficiency. Mason closed the door gently, feeling as though he'd just participated in something that transcended ordinary experience. The kitten, perhaps sensing the significance of what had occurred, moved to Mason's feet and, for the first time, deliberately, pressed against his leg in a gesture unmistakably like affection. "What happens now?" Mason asked, looking to Jenny for guidance. Jenny's expression had transformed from professional assessment to genuine wonder. "I honestly don't know. This goes beyond anything covered in wildlife rehabilitation manuals." She watched the kitten navigate confidently around Mason's furniture. "But I think you've been chosen, Mason, for reasons we may never fully understand. That mother believes you are her kitten's best chance. But I don't know how to raise a blind bobcat," Mason protested, the enormity of the situation finally hitting him. "No one does," Jenny admitted. "But I suspect that's not really what she's asking of you." "What then?" "To provide safety while her kitten learns to navigate his world without sight. To be a guardian during his most vulnerable period." Jenny's gaze turned thoughtful. "And perhaps, though this may sound strange, to learn something from him in return." "Learn what?" Mason asked, watching as the kitten confidently located his water dish and drank. "That blindness, whether physical or emotional, doesn't have to mean isolation," Jenny said softly. "That adaptation is possible, even after profound loss." Her words struck uncomfortably close to truths Mason had avoided for 7 years. The parallel between the kitten's physical blindness and his own emotional withdrawal was too pointed to dismiss. As the afternoon light began to fade, Jenny prepared to leave, promising to return with specialized supplies and resources to help Mason with his unexpected charge. At the door, she paused, her expression serious. "Mason, may I ask you something?" "Personal?" He tensed but nodded, already guessing her question. "What happened 7 years ago that brought you up here, away from everything and everyone?" For a moment, Mason considered deflecting, as he had countless times when others had approached this subject. But something about the day's events, the mother's trust, the kitten's resilience, Jenny's compassionate insight, broke through defenses long maintained. "I lost my family," he said simply, the words emerging from a place he rarely acknowledged. "My wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily. Car accident on Highway 22, Black Ice. I was supposed to be driving them, but I stayed behind to finish a photography assignment." He swallowed hard. "I've been blind ever since. Not like him," he nodded toward the kitten, "but blind all the same." Jenny's expression held no pity, only understanding. "Perhaps that's why she chose you," she said gently. "Like recognizes like, even across species." And after Jenny departed, Mason sat on his porch as twilight deepened into dusk, the kitten curled contentedly in his lap. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, he knew, the mother bobcat watched, an invisible presence maintaining her vigil, even as she entrusted her offspring to human care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, but for tonight, Mason allowed himself to feel something he had avoided for 7 years. The tentative unfurling of connection, the cautious acceptance that isolation might not be the only response to loss. In the soft purring of the blind kitten against his chest, Mason recognized a truth both simple and profound. Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected sources, crossing boundaries we believed impermeable, illuminating paths forward we couldn't previously see. Summer bloomed across the Cascade Wilderness, painting Mason's forest surroundings with vibrant life. 3 weeks had passed since the extraordinary day when the mother bobcat had seemingly entrusted her blind kitten to his care, and life at the cabin had fallen into new rhythms that would have been unimaginable to Mason just a month earlier. The kitten, whom Mason had begun calling Scout for his remarkable ability to navigate his surroundings, had grown noticeably, his once fluffy coat developing the more sleek appearance of adolescence. Under Jenny's guidance, Mason had established a feeding regimen that supported healthy development while respecting the bobcat's natural diet. Scout's blindness seemed increasingly irrelevant, as his other senses compensated with astonishing efficiency. Most remarkable, however, was the continued presence of Scout's mother. Though she never again approached as boldly as on that pivotal afternoon, evidence of her vigilance appeared daily. Fresh tracks circling the cabin, occasional gifts of prey left on the porch, and sometimes, in the deep quiet of dawn or dusk, her silent form visible at the forest's edge, watching. "It's like co-parenting with a wild bobcat," Jenny had observed during one of her regular visits to check Scout's development. "I've never seen anything like it in all my years of wildlife work." For Mason, the arrangement had catalyzed unexpected changes. His carefully constructed isolation had become permeable, first through Jenny's regular presence, then through occasional visits from Sam Peterson, who'd taken a genuine interest in Scout's progress, and even Harriet Thompson, who arrived one Sunday with freshly baked bread and thinly veiled curiosity about the cabin she'd heard so much about over the years. Most significantly, Mason had begun photographing again. It started with simple documentation of Scout's development for Jenny's records, but soon expanded into a growing portfolio, capturing the unique relationship between the blind bobcat kitten and his vigilant wild mother. Something about viewing life through a lens again, finding beauty in unexpected moments, preserving fleeting connections, reawakened a part of Mason he had deliberately silenced after Sarah and Lily's passing. On this particular morning, Mason woke to find Scout missing from his usual sleeping spot near the wood stove. A moment of panic subsided when Mason spotted the slightly ajar door leading to the porch. He must have failed to secure it properly the night before. Stepping outside, Mason scanned the clearing anxiously until he spotted a sight that stopped him mid-stride. In the dewy grass at the forest's edge, Scout was engaged in what could only be described as play with his mother. The adult bobcat moved with deliberate restraint, offering gentle swats and encouraging nudges as Scout pounced on invisible targets identified by sound and scent. Despite his blindness, Scout followed his mother's movements with impressive accuracy, compensating for his lack of vision through acute hearing and whisker sensitivity. Mason remained absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe as he witnessed this extraordinary interaction. The mother's patience was remarkable, her movements clearly adapted to accommodate her offspring's disability. More striking still was Scout's confidence. Far from helpless, he displayed the natural hunting instincts of his species, modified to work within his unique constraints. After perhaps 15 minutes, the mother noticed Mason's presence and went still, amber eyes assessing him across the clearing. Scout, sensing the change in his mother's behavior, oriented himself toward the cabin, recognizing Mason's scent on the morning breeze. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The mother bobcat gave her kitten a final gentle nudge in Mason's direction, then retreated several steps into the forest undergrowth, not fleeing but clearly creating space. Scout, understanding. This guidance, with an awareness that transcended ordinary animal behavior, turned and made his way back toward the cabin with confident steps. Upon reaching Mason, he pressed against his legs in familiar greeting, as if these divided loyalties, wild and domestic, were the most natural arrangement in the world. "Good morning to you too," Mason murmured, crouching to run his hand along Scout's growing frame. "Made a jailbreak to see your mom, did you?" The significance of what he'd witnessed settled into Mason's consciousness as he prepared breakfast, Scout weaving figure eights around his ankles with typical feline entitlement. The mother was training her blind offspring, showing him how to navigate the world despite his limitations. And more remarkably, she was including Mason in this process, creating a shared custody arrangement that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. Later that morning, as Mason sat on his porch swing with his camera, capturing the interplay of light through the forest canopy, his phone rang, an unusual occurrence given his limited social connections. Jenny's name flashed on the screen. "Mason, are you sitting down?" Her voice carried an excitement he hadn't heard before. "Actually, yes. What's going on?" "Remember those photos you sent me last week? The ones showing Scout's mother leaving that arranged circle of material on your porch?" Of course. The latest of the mother, Bobcat's curious offerings, had been particularly elaborate. A careful arrangement of moss, feathers, and small twigs formed into a perfect circle. I shared them with Dr. Eleanor Simmons at Oregon State. She's the leading wildlife behaviorist, studying cognitive complexity in North American predators. Jenny paused for dramatic effect. "Mason, she's absolutely fascinated. Says she's never seen documented evidence of this type of symbolic communication from bobcats before. She wants to meet you and Scout as soon as possible." Mason's instinctive resistance to outsiders flared briefly, then subsided. The old walls he'd built around himself seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of what Scout and his mother had already changed. "What would this involve?" he asked cautiously. "Just observation, documentation. Eleanor is exceptionally respectful of wildlife. She understands this is unprecedented and wants to proceed with appropriate sensitivity." Jenny's voice softened. "Mason, this could be important. Not just for understanding bobcats, but for expanding our conception of animal cognition generally." "I'll think about it," Mason promised, surprising himself with his openness to the possibility. After ending the call, Mason remained on the porch, watching Scout explore the familiar territory of the clearing with confident precision. The blind bobcat had carved a unique path between wild and domestic worlds, neither fully one nor the other. In doing so, he'd shown Mason possibilities the photographer had never considered, ways of adapting to profound loss without complete withdrawal. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in dramatic oranges and purples, Mason made a decision that had been gradually forming in his mind for days. Scout was growing quickly, his independence increasing with each passing week. Though his blindness presented unique challenges, it was becoming increasingly clear that the young bobcat possessed extraordinary adaptive capabilities. More significantly, his mother remained committed to his development, her consistent presence, a testament to bonds that transcended conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. The arrangement they had established, this strange co-parenting between human and wild bobcat, had worked thus far, but Mason knew it couldn't continue indefinitely. Scout deserved the opportunity to test his capabilities in the environment, for which evolution had designed him, blindness notwithstanding. Time to start the next phase, Mason told Scout, who had curled against his leg on the porch swing, purring with resonant contentment. Your mom's been preparing you all along. I think she knew what I'm just figuring out, that you were never meant to stay. The following morning, Mason implemented the plan he'd discussed with Jenny the previous evening. He left his cabin, door partially open, and positioned his best wildlife camera to capture whatever might unfold. Then he retreated to the small workshop behind his cabin where he could observe without interference. Scout, sensing the change in routine, explored the open door with evident curiosity, whiskers twitching as outdoor scents flooded his sensitive nose. For nearly an hour, the young bobcat moved back and forth across the threshold, venturing slightly further into the clearing with each exploration before retreating to the familiar safety of the cabin. Then, with timing that seemed almost orchestrated, Scout's mother appeared at the forest edge, emitting the distinctive call Mason had come to recognize. Scout froze, ears swiveling to pinpoint the beloved sound. Without hesitation, he moved toward it with surprising speed and accuracy, navigating across the open clearing as if he could see every obstacle. Mason held his breath as mother and offspring, reunited in a moment of pure connection. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in Scout's movements, only recognition and belonging. The mother bobcat inspected her growing kitten thoroughly, then, with gentle guidance, began leading him toward the forest. Mason had prepared himself for this moment, knowing it represented the natural progression that had been building since the night he found Scout in the storm. Still, he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest as the two bobcats reached the tree line, Scout following his mother with confident steps despite his blindness. At the edge of the forest, something extraordinary happened. Something Mason would later review on his camera footage dozens of times, still marveling at its significance. The mother bobcat paused and turned, looking directly back at the cabin. Scout, sensing her stop, oriented himself similarly. For a long moment, both bobcats remained still, their posture conveying something that transcended species boundaries. Acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Then they were gone, disappearing into the dappled shadows of the forest with the silent efficiency that had evolved over thousands of generations. Mason remained in his workshop for hours, emotions too complex to name washing through him in waves. Loss and fulfillment, sadness and rightness, ending and beginning, all intertwined in a tapestry that reflected the intricate patterns of life itself. That evening, preparing for his first night alone in weeks, Mason found himself moving through his cabin with heightened awareness of Scout's absence. The small adaptations he'd made for the blind bobcat, the consistent placement of furniture, the textured pathways between important locations, the careful organization of space, now stood as silent testimony to a chapter concluded. Yet rather than emptiness, Mason felt a curious fullness, as if Scout had left behind something essential that would remain long after physical traces of his presence faded. Mason stepped onto his porch to watch nightfall transform the forest, a ritual he had performed countless times during his years of isolation. The familiar sounds enveloped him. Distant owl calls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures awakening, wind moving through pine needles with gentle persistence. As darkness deepened, Mason prepared to return inside, then froze as his eyes caught something unusual on the porch floor. There, arranged in perfect symmetry, lay a circle of forest materials, moss, twigs, feathers, and pine needles woven together with intricate precision. In the center rested a single perfect pine cone. Mason crouched to examine this unexpected offering, recognizing it as a final gift from Scout's mother. The arrangement was no random collection of materials, but a deliberate creation, a symbol whose meaning transcended the limitations of interspecies communication. As Mason carefully lifted the circular arrangement, understanding bloomed within him. This wasn't merely a goodbye, it was an invitation to see differently, to recognize connections that existed beyond conventional boundaries. The circle, ancient symbol of wholeness, continuity, and belonging, spoke to something universal that both human and bobcat might comprehend. In this moment of insight, Mason felt the final walls around his heart crumble, defenses constructed after Sarah and Lily's passing that had protected him from further pain, but also prevented healing. Scout and his mother had showed him another way forward, not by denying loss or vulnerability, but by adapting to it with courage and creativity. Dawn found Mason in his long-neglected home office, surrounded by photography equipment that had remained untouched for 7 years. With renewed purpose, he began assembling his cameras, checking lenses, and organizing gear. The portfolio he had begun with Scout, documenting the extraordinary relationship between a blind bobcat kitten and his adaptive mother, represented only the beginning. There were stories in these forests waiting to be captured, connections between species that challenged conventional understanding, moments of beauty and resilience that deserved witnessing. Mason had spent 7 years hiding from life. Now, he felt ready to document it again, to participate rather than merely observe. As summer deepened into autumn, Mason's cabin underwent subtle transformations. Photographs lined walls that had been deliberately bare for years. Books on wildlife behavior and cognition filled shelves previously empty. Most significantly, visitors became more frequent, Jenny Wilcox bringing research updates, Dr. Eleanor Simmons discussing her observations, even Harriet Thompson delivering baked goods, and town news with increasing regularity. Scout and his mother appeared occasionally, always at the forest's edge, never approaching the cabin directly but clearly aware of Mason's presence. Through his telephoto lens, Mason documented Scout's growing capability, marveling at how the young bobcat had adapted to his blindness with extraordinary efficiency. Under his mother's guidance, he had developed techniques for hunting, territorial, navigation, and predator avoidance that compensated for his lack of vision. Dr. Simmons confirmed what Mason had sensed, that Scout's mother represented something exceptional, a level of cognitive complexity and adaptability rarely documented in wild felines. Her ability to modify her behavior to accommodate her offspring's disability, her willingness to include a human in this process, and her apparent capacity for symbolic communication represented significant discoveries for wildlife science. One crisp October morning, Mason woke to an email from National Geographic responding to the portfolio he had submitted weeks earlier. They were interested in publishing his photo essay, Seeing Differently, the Extraordinary Bond Between a Blind Bobcat and His Mother, with an accompanying article exploring the implications for understanding wildlife cognition and interspecies connection. As Mason stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the cool morning air, he spotted familiar tracks circling his cabin. Mother and offspring had visited during the night. Following their trail to the edge of his clearing, Mason noticed something unusual hanging from a low branch. A perfect circle of woven materials, similar to those the mother had previously left, but larger and more elaborate. The symbolism wasn't lost on Mason. Circles represented wholeness, continuity, and connection, concepts that transcended species boundaries. From the day he had found Scout trembling in the storm to this moment of professional renaissance, his journey had followed an unexpected circular path, returning him to life and connection when he had believed such possibilities forever closed. Later that day, as Mason prepared to drive into Oak Ridge for lunch with Jenny and Dr. Simmons, he paused at the photograph of Sarah and Lily he had finally placed on his living room wall after 7 years of keeping it hidden away. Their smiling faces no longer triggered only pain, but a complex blend of emotions that included love, gratitude, and acceptance. "You would have loved this story," he told them softly, a blind bobcat kitten and his extraordinary mother teaching a stubborn photographer how to see again. Mason drove down the mountain with windows open to the autumn air, conscious of how dramatically his life had transformed in just a few months. The isolation he had clung to as protection had been breached by unlikely teachers, a blind bobcat finding his way without sight, a mother adapting with remarkable creativity to her offspring's limitations, a wildlife rehabilitator extending compassion to human and animal alike. From these unexpected connections had emerged a truth both simple and profound, that belonging was not something to be found in perfect circumstances, but created through adaptation, courage, and openness to possibilities beyond conventional boundaries. Mason had lost his human family in a moment of random tragedy, but in accepting his vulnerability rather than hiding from it, he had discovered a different kind of belonging, one that embraced the entire living world around him. As his truck rounded the final curve, offering a panoramic view of the valley below, Mason caught a glimpse of movement at the forest edge. Two bobcats, one larger and one smaller, moving with synchronized grace through dappled shadows. He slowed, watching as they paused briefly in a shaft of sunlight, their tawny coats gleaming like burnished gold. The smaller bobcat turned, seeming to look directly toward Mason's vehicle despite eyes that saw no light. For a moment suspended, in time, Mason felt the connection between them, not severed by Scout's return to the wild, but transformed into something enduring that transcended physical proximity. Then they were gone, disappearing into the forest with silent efficiency, leaving only their story behind, a story of adaptation, of unique perception, of boundaries crossed and assumptions challenged. A story that Mason would continue to tell through his photography and writing, honoring the extraordinary teachers who had shown him that sometimes the most profound sight comes only after accepting blindness. The circle was complete, yet ever expanding, like the perfect woven rings Scout's mother created, like the cycles of seasons transforming the forest, like the continuous journey of healing that had no final destination but offered unexpected beauty at every turn. Mason continued down the mountain toward Oak Ridge, toward connection, toward engagement with the world he had once abandoned. Behind him, the forest kept its secrets, its wild inhabitants following ancient patterns while adapting to ever-changing circumstances. A dance of resilience Mason had finally learned to join, seeing differently now, with eyes transformed by unexpected love. Dear listeners, we hope Mason and Scout's remarkable journey has touched your heart. Their story reminds us that healing often comes from the most unexpected sources, crossing boundaries we believed impermeable and illuminating paths we couldn't previously see. For more emotionally captivating stories that explore the profound connections between humans and the natural world, we've prepared a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If this tale of adaptation and renewed hope resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexity and beauty. Don't miss our upcoming content, and please share your thoughts in the comments below. What unexpected teacher has helped you see differently in your own life? We'd love to hear your story.